thank you all for those very illuminating comments. I think what I'll do now is put maybe one question to each of you and allow you to cover other issues that you may want to respond to. And then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So my first question to Sana is sort of picking up on where Jamal left off. It's clear that the diplomatic process is going nowhere. And you talked about the need to put pressure on policymakers to push the parties back to the negotiating table. Is there something that the Yemenis themselves can do, or some contingent of Yemenis inside or outside, or perhaps even inside and outside of Yemen, who can start to kind of coalesce around the idea of sort of rebuilding a national consensus of some sort? Is there anything like that currently afoot? Is there any sort of initiative like that? And is that something that you see as that would help, or is the solution something that should be imposed from the outside?
So, thank you for that question. It actually goes into a lot of the ideas that I was writing down as I heard the other speakers discuss their points. One of the things that I would like to strongly oppose is that I believe that if Saudi Arabia and Iran decided to leave this war alone, it will in fact get better in Yemen. I don't think that if you do that, it will continue to be the same. And that's very important because with this war, there's a lot of, before working on Yemen during this war, there are many things that I never realized are processes of war that happen behind the scenes. And by that I mean there's a lot of money going into agents that are warmongers, that want the war to continue. There's a lot of hate speech. There's a lot of just what I see today is a lot of Yemenis who are easily employed through money to have political opinions of some sort or the other. And that's really unfortunate for Yemen. When it comes to the idea of a religious dictatorship in Yemen, I do think that that is in fact what would happen if the Houthis continue to rule. But at the same time, I do think that the other forces on the ground in Yemen do represent other religious forces that would impose a similar religious dictatorship just on another sect or on the other end of the spectrum. And when it comes to the subject of Islah specifically, I do see that the UAE and Saudi Arabia had some clashes over it, where some would say that the UAE is very clear and adamant that they do not want to partner up with Islah, who are the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen, or like the wing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen. And Saudi Arabia actually at the start of the war had no problem supporting them. And with that, we do see that there's an attempt to kind of stay away from them, but to say that you cannot fight the Houthis militarily without using Islah means that if you use Islah to fight the Houthis, you are in fact perpetuating a sectarian war because they are on the opposite end of each other. And that is extremely dangerous. So in fact, not using them to fight each other is in the best interests of everyone. When it comes to, and this comes to your question, what is the diplomatic process in Yemen right now? There is a diplomatic process where there are conferences around the world where they bring Yemeni political actors and advisors from all over the world and specialists and mediators. And then there's also a continuation of Yemen's national dialogue process, believe it or not. Yemen's national dialogue process started in 2012 or 2013, and it was supposed to be the solution to Yemen's problems because everybody in Yemen knew that Yemen was going to face a lot of serious problems, specifically with the Houthis and the southern Iraq. And so this national dialogue was supposed to solve these problems. What we see is that it didn't work, but this group was able to produce some outcomes that the UN and the international community tries to constantly mention and bring up and enforce, even though in today's climate, they're probably not relevant at all anymore. They would have to start from zero and see what's happening. When it comes to the diplomatic process, the problem with the talks is that they are far too large and they're far too grand and far too important. There are travels involved, there are all these events, and the national dialogue process was 556 members, and that's exactly why the peace process didn't work in Yemen, because guess what had to happen back in 2012 so that the Houthis don't come into Sana'a? President Hadi should have mediated directly with the head of the Houthi leadership, should have heard their demands then, that would be the process for peace. Right now, today, to have peace in Yemen, all you need is Saudi willingness and Houthi willingness to kind of come to the table and say, we don't want war anymore. We're going to put our weapons down while we negotiate and come to some sort of agreement. And the will is going to have to come that way. I think, unfortunately, when I speak to the majority of Yemenis, they feel that they are worthless in their own countries. Their opinions and their voices don't matter. And their desire for peace doesn't amount to anything. And their willingness is, I would live under any circumstance right now if I have dignity, if I have money so I can feed my family, if I can have a job and take care of my children. And that is really as basic as it gets in Yemen. So in terms of national consensus on the ground in Yemen, I think it's really hard to have any kind of national consensus when there's an active warfare, mostly because there is heavy recruitment for war on both sides, and it's not very easy to move for mobility. And ultimately, and this is the most dangerous thing that Yemen is facing right now, there are no current figures that look like they can encompass everyone in Yemen. You have a southern secessionist movement. You have the north of the north being very radical with the Houthis. Then you have the city of Taz that is pretty much isolated. And a lot of the local populace there have been displaced and had to live in other cities. And then you have the city of Tahama where they're really starving, and that's where the aid goes in. And it's just all over a mess. And it's very difficult to find a political figure who right now is speaking to the people, who is willing to represent their voice and their demand. And the sooner the war stops, the easier it's going to be, oh, well, this is a great political national figure, because as long as the war continues, people are going to be like, wait, is this person representing Saudi interests? Are they representing Iranian interests? Are they representing Houthi interests? Are they representing Taizzi interests? There's just this constant doubt that Yemenis are not trusting each other right now. This is a civil war. And so ultimately, I think, and this is, we all agree here that the US has a major role in this conflict. We both know that France and the US can get involved in this, but ultimately they are right now interested in this war for arms deals. There's a lot of money involved in this, and nobody wants this money to go to China or to Russia or anyone else. And I think it's in the US's best interest in the future to de-escalate the tension that we are sensing now, to bring itself as a mediator of peace, to reassert itself. I mean, one of the things that is really upsetting in Yemen's war is for 4 years now, the only embassy that was able to stay in for a long time was the Russian embassy. I mean, all these governments that used to have representation in Yemen need to go back there. All the institutions, education, health, everything like that, they need to function again. Normalcy needs to come back in. And ultimately, the only way forward is to have the Saudis and the Houthis talk behind closed doors, it doesn't even have to be public, to come to an agreement, to put the weapons aside for now, and to talk at the peace table and figure out what they see or what they envision for Yemen.
Thank you, Sima. You talked, of course, a lot about the United States as an active belligerent in this war. And is there any indication, in your view, that the position of the United States, of the Trump administration, has shifted in any way? We've heard some recent comments from the new Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, some pretty direct words directed at their friends in Riyadh to both end their kind of attempts to isolate Qatar and also to sort of scale down the war in Yemen. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where the Trump administration is now and if there's been any shift.
Well, it certainly appears the Trump administration is frustrated. I mean, the president himself, I mean, he's an interesting character. He seems to be one, if you put photos in front of him of a conflict, it does disturb him. And after that was done on the blockade, you know, he made some statements about trying to lift the blockade. I think they understand that this kind of a conflict, that, you know, a war that was supposed to take 2 or 3 weeks or something to kind of put the right guy back in power that 3 years later is going on, is obviously not good for their major ally, the Saudi Arabia. That if you want to focus on Iran, this is, you know, I think certainly the U.S. State Department and Defense Department can recognize this is a bad deal. The challenge, I suppose, is what are they going to back it up with? If you carry on your current policy, everybody says, yes, that's very nice, thank you very much, and let's move on. That as long as you provide military support, if you do nothing to change your policy, why on earth should they listen? Your actions speak louder than words. So I haven't seen changes. It'll be interesting, Pompeo, having just taken over, will he try to do more? There was some thought that he might have been kind of on the other side of the Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, et cetera, divide, and he seems to have taken, I suspect, not so much he cares about which country, but he wants to get it over with, to have a unified voice to use and work with in the Gulf as opposed to have it divided over these issues. So with the new Secretary of State, and I'm not sure what John Bolton thinks of this, but conceivably with the new national security team, they could, in fact, do more. I'm not sure if they will. I think Korea and other things are going to be taking an awful lot of attention. And I think the challenge here is, at least I find the notion that Washington can solve this. Yeah, it's done so well at, resolving, Israel-Palestinians. It got, Syria very nicely done. I mean, Libya is, kind of a wonderful utopia. Iraq has gone extraordinarily well, even after we occupied it. American officials, in my view, don't do this stuff very well. I mean, my experience is nuance on the ground tends to escape, the folks. And I just don't have any reason to believe they're going to get Yemen any better. And I'm not sure what the incentive is. The reality is U.S. is an active belligerent, with an extraordinarily hostile policy towards Iran. So the question is, how do you show up and then act as if you're going to be the mediator and bring peace? I mean, is the U.S. willing to offer something? One could imagine going in and saying, I don't know, we keep the JCPOA if Iran will do something. I mean, you could imagine that, but I don't perceive that's terribly likely to happen. If the U.S. is not willing to actually offer something, I don't see how it brings everybody to the table and what it proposes as a solution. I don't see the incentives there. I'd love to see democracy, but I have to say, I'm not going to hold my breath on democracy in Yemen until the major parties who are involved have democracy at home. I mean, in January, Saudi Arabia sentenced to long prison terms activists in a human rights organization. This is under the great reformist prince who is bringing nirvana to Saudi Arabia. People still go to jail. Raif Badawi remains in jail, a 10-year jail sentence. His lawyer got 15 years. So I'm just very skeptical that the major belligerents as a part of the coalition have any interest in democracy. I mean, it's rather hard for them to go and suddenly say, let's hold municipal elections in a neighboring country, but we won't do it at home. Right. I think that's a problem. Look, the Houthis are bad. These are hardly, in my view, a friendly group. Though if one's thinking about sectarian rule, it's hard to compete with the Saudis. But there's 50 years of history of Yemen. What regime was a good one? I have no idea. I mean, this is a country that's gone through both as two countries in one country. It's gone through war between the countries. It's gone through internal civil war. It's gone through separatist movements. And it has had people who play both sides. I mean, Saleh, the Houthis. I mean, Saleh's, it's kind of the longest running, this dominant personality who at one point, of course, is an enemy of the Houthis, wants to work with the Saudis against the Houthis, gets America involved, and then ends up, working with the Houthis because he wants to get Hadi out of power. I don't know what one would try to propose as a government here. The notion it could be imposed from outside and the notion that anything imposed would be stable and last over time, I think is a fantasy. The internal dynamics there, then again, the problem is outsiders who don't live in that context, who are not part of that process, who are not the people living under the rulers, it's very hard to show up and suddenly say, I have a great idea. I mean, the U.S. tried that with Serbia and the Kosovars with the Rambouillet, where Madeleine Albright showed up, came up with this wonderful idea of an argument. And I remember the Newsweek article when it all broke up and said she was mad at everybody because everybody didn't realize what a wonderful plan she had. Well, she didn't live there. She wasn't part of that. She wasn't part of that experience. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it clearly is a much more diverse, open political process that brings in all parties. It should not be a Houthi-run government. But Hadi's not the man who's going to do that, so the legitimate government, if you want to call it that, is not the answer. But I don't think it's going to be imposed by the Saudis or the Emiratis. I don't know what it is, but I don't think the U.S. gets it right. So I come back to the question of what is America's interest. The U.S. has been consistently at war since 2001. I think it's time for the U.S. to be backing away from war, seeing war as an answer. Decade after along, we're still at war, backing others in war, achieving, as far as I can tell, nothing that advances America's interests.
Thanks, Doug. I want to pick up on this. Obviously, we have very different opinions on what sort of role the United States could play. But I want to ask Jamal, since you were so adamant that the United States is not the problem, it's in fact the solution. If it does what? That's my question to you: is if it does what? And let me kind of preface that with, as Doug mentioned, the American track record in terms of its role as a mediator is mixed at best. And as someone who, me personally, is focused primarily on Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I guess the question I would ask is, how does the United States play a role, an effective role? Forget about an honest role or even-handed. I don't think those are credible expectations, but how does the United States play an effective role as a mediator when it is so close to one of the belligerents and in fact has a special relationship of sorts with Saudi Arabia? So how does the United States balance its special relationship with Riyadh with its desire to end the conflict rather than simply putting its thumb on the scale as we've seen in other conflicts?
Since Riyadh in the side of the legitimacy, the United States will be on the side of the legitimacy when it works with Riyadh. They cannot be on the side of the Houthi, who are rebels, who are taking over Yemen by force. I think Americans underestimate their ability in the region. They can be the player. They can be the decider in the conflict. What happened in Bosnia, Kosovo, it wasn't the ideal peace, but at least it stopped the guns. If you speak today to the people in Bosnia, many of them are unhappy with the agreement. Is that a perfect agreement? I often call Lebanon the best Arab failed democracy, but it is working. Lebanon is working. They're going to have an election soon. Democracy is possible in Yemen. Some form of democracy, not necessarily a palette-style box democracy. Some form of consensus that bring tribal leaders, various military, all kind of Salafis. In Yemen there's 3 or 4 Salafis, not only one Salafi. ISIS-type Salafi, pro-Saudi Arabian Salafis, and all kind of Salafis in Yemen. All of those people had to be represented in some form of a lawyer jirga, the Afghani Grand Majlis, that bring all type of all representative of the society. It is possible. It will not bring an ideal situation. The Yemenis were hoping and striving and fighting for good governance since 1948. And they haven't reached that yet. But they have that notion. They want that to be delivered to them. The Houthi are not the answer. And we, the Saudis, are not the one to impose that. What is important is we allow it. We will not be an obstacle to it. And it could work. What the matter now is just to stop the war in Yemen, and that will lead to some for Yemenis to engage. I agree with you when you said, yes, if the Saudi and the Houthi meet behind closed door, and they have been meeting repeatedly. I think even Mohammed Abdel Salam, who was killed by the Saudis last week, took part in some of those meetings in Dhahran al-Janub. Mohammed Abdel Salam is okay? Okay, all right, okay, good. Then, so they were meeting with the Saudis repeatedly. But it did not work. There is a need for a third party, and I think the proper third party are the Americans. And they can play a role. They underestimate their ability. They should look how much the Russians have gained by their absence and regain their position. And the Russians came into our region to fight. Maybe the Americans can come back to our region to bring peace. Thank you. Maybe.